בהר סיני, דינך אמת ואמיתה, הוד ויקר היא מלכותך, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל. עלהו בו עמנואל, ופדה משבי ישראל, שמתייפח בגלותו, עד בן האל בא לפדותו, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל.
Welcome to The Voice of Jacob. I'm Gideon Lazar.
And I'm Yarden and Gideon.
And today we're going to be discussing the Feast of the Presentation, or as it's often known in the West, the Feast of Candlemas.
Right. It's continuing the theme from the circumcision of the Lord. It's the Jewish events of Jesus' life that I think should take a much bigger part in our consciousness of the liturgical cycle.
Yeah, it's so interesting how sort of the whole life, especially of someone who's living in Second Temple Judaism, is really preserved in our liturgical calendar, as different events in their life are things that Christ did, and Christ then incorporates all of that sort of life into himself, that then becomes the basis for the Christian liturgical calendar.
Right. It's and it's also kind of an interesting maybe segue into modern Judaism, because while there are differences, and I'm not saying that Orthodox Judaism today is exactly what it was late Second Temple era, it's interesting that the things preserved in the New Testament are things that continued, and sometimes continued very similarly into modern Jewish life, making a very interesting bridge between these two worlds.
Yeah, it was very interesting as we were researching for this podcast to find that so many things in the presentation, as it's described in Scripture, with the exception of the sacrificial element, are really all preserved still in modern Judaism.
Right, yeah. So maybe we can start by talking a little bit about what this ritual looks like in modern Judaism and its sources, and then see where that takes us with the celebration of the commemoration of that event in Jesus' life.
There's actually two distinct rituals here going on that are both preserved in modern Judaism. Because the first thing you have is the dedication of the firstborn. Because when the Israelites left Egypt, God struck down the firstborn of the Egyptians, but preserved the firstborn of the Israelites. And so in commemoration of this, they would take the firstborn son of every Israelite family and would do a ceremony of consecration.
Yeah, that's right. And there are kind of there are a few criteria as to when that actually happens. And we can see that in earlier stages, it's pretty clear in the Bible that the priestly role was kind of reserved for the father of the family, and continuing him is the firstborn. And then at the sin of the golden calf, it's the tribe of Levi that kind of springs to action and kills everybody that needs to be killed for what happened, which ends up being actually quite a small number compared to how many people committed the sin of the golden calf. And at that point, that tribe is dedicated to serve in priestly and kind of para-priestly roles. So actually offering the sacrifice and everything that has to do around it. And everybody born to the house of Israel, every firstborn, is still kind of almost like a priest presumptive that needs to be redeemed with money so that he's no longer obligated to be sent over to the temple to serve. So this needs to be the son of an Israelite father and mother. And by this, I don't mean that they're Jewish. I mean that they're not from the tribe of Levi. So, for example, my family on both sides are Levites. So I've actually never seen this ritual take place because all of the women are daughters of Levites and all of the men are Levites. So I've actually never seen it, but I have friends who've done it. It needs to be firstborn to his mother regardless of whether his father had other children, which I think is interesting because, for one thing, the New Testament explicitly says that he was Mary's firstborn. And this still kind of leaves room for whether or not Joseph had other children from a previous marriage. It doesn't actually solve that problem, whether he was a young man consecrated or an old man with previous marriage children. It needs to be a son that was born naturally, so not using C-section, which is actually mentioned in very ancient Jewish sources. And if there was an advanced stage abortion or miscarriage beforehand, then you don't need to redeem the child. And if there was an early stage miscarriage or abortion, it's kind of debated exactly at what phase of the pregnancy you still would need to redeem the first son that's born after that.
The other ritual this is connected with is the purification of the woman after childbirth. As we see in Leviticus 11 through 15, we have these series of different things that are marked as unclean. I think a lot of Christians sometimes will misunderstand this because we think unclean equals sinful, because there is a symbolic connection used in the New Testament frequently of using the idea of uncleanness as a symbol of sinfulness. But it's actually not in itself sinfulness. It's just, it makes someone ritually impure such that they could not partake of, for example, the ceremonies of the temple while they were unclean. And so one of the things that would make someone unclean has to do with flows of blood, because blood represents life. And so the loss of blood represents uncleanness. There's actually, I think, a very close association between things being unclean and death. And so when the woman gives birth, right, there's a flow of blood that comes about as a result of it. And so because of this flow of blood, she would be unclean for a certain number of days. For a male child, it would be 40 days, and for a female child, it would be 80 days. The circumcision of the son would sort of cut in half the number of days in which it would be unclean. And so Mary is also, we see here, coming to be purified after the 40 days, even though she did not have a flow of blood at all, and we'll get into that later on in the podcast. She still came to the temple to fulfill the whole ritual of purification after childbirth.
Right, and I think the interesting thing about this purification process, in Judaism you don't really see it today because there is no temple. So many of these purity things, or at least I haven't seen it. Anybody who has seen it is more than welcome to correct me. But a place that you do see it, and I think will be surprising to some people, for some people to hear, is a lot of Eastern churches. If I remember correctly, the Syriac Rite does do it, and I think all of the Alexandrian churches still do it, where if the woman had a son, she won't come to church for 40 days, and if she had a daughter, she won't come to church for 80 days. And if I remember correctly, in the Syriac church, there's a kind of presentation ritual for the newborn, after which the woman returns to the liturgy.
Yeah, this is in the Byzantine Rite as well. So since I'm Byzantine Rite, all of my children were brought in for the presentation, and the priest would bring up our children to the altar to dedicate them. And it's interesting, they're reciting a number of scriptural verses as they're doing this, which are either prophecies of the virgin birth or connected with this Old Testament purification ritual. And they'll make the explicit connection of just as Christ was presented 40 days after his birth, that now this child is presented 40 days after this birth. And for a male child, when they're brought into all the way up to the altar there, that's actually seen as if they're going to become a priest. This is their first step towards the priesthood as they're being brought into the temple. In terms of, is this practiced in modern Judaism? In Orthodox Jewish communities, they actually still practice purification and will treat it very seriously. So if you go into Orthodox Jewish communities, they'll have something called a mikveh, which will be a body of water in which people will be immersed to purify themselves from ritual impurities. And this is still treated very seriously in some communities.
No, you're right. And I mean, I live in a big city that's fairly religious, so the municipality does build a lot of mikvahs, at least one for every neighborhood. What I'm not sure about, maybe maybe some of the listeners do, is whether women avoid going to synagogue until they have been purified.
I see what you're saying. I don't know about that one. That'd be very interesting if anyone can comment below if they know.
Yeah.
This then gets brought into the Christian tradition then, right? As we mentioned, first of all, the dedication of children, but also 40 days after Christmas, we then celebrate the presentation of Christ in the temple. And as well, after you have the nativity of Mary, there's later on a feast for the dedication of Mary in the temple as well. I was looking into the origins of this feast, and it seems to be very, very ancient. Because Christmas was always celebrated around the time of year it currently is, but the exact date seems to have floated around to a number of different places in the early church before eventually settling on December 25th. But we do have records already in the 4th century that the Feast of the Presentation was always celebrated 40 days after whenever they would do Christmas.
Right. I think it's very interesting that it's kind of very enduring. It was always understood that Christmas needs to be celebrated, even if there was some debate about the date. And even though for a very long time there was a lot of attempt to part ways with Judaism, everybody saw this encounter as something that's kind of fundamental to the timeline of Jesus' life and to the process of our salvation.
Yeah, and it seems, as far as I can tell, to be present in every liturgical rite. I don't know the non-Byzantine Eastern rites as well, so perhaps if someone attends one of those and can let us know if it's not the case in their rite. But as far as I could tell, this seems to be present in every rite. Then the West, interestingly, it's connected with candles, and there seems to be various reasons that have been given in the tradition. So, for example, we have Saint Bede, discusses how this is connected with Christ as the light of the Gentiles, because when he is presented in the temple, St. Simeon lifts him up and refers to him as a light of revelation for the Gentiles. And so the idea is this candle represents the light of Christ going out to the nations. Pope Innocent XII, interestingly, just connects it historically. There was a devotion in ancient Rome to the goddess Ceres that used candles. And so the idea was to bring people over from this. They wanted to bring their traditions with them and offer everything they have in their culture to Christ. And so they brought in the tradition of candles, but now it's to honor the Mother of God instead of this pagan goddess. And it seems, from what I could tell, historians debate whether or not this is actually historically accurate or not. But I think it shows, at least in the consciousness of the church, that there's nothing problematic about bringing over some sort of ritual that was once used in a pagan context to now honor Christ in the church, as long as it's not intrinsically wrong. The practice can often actually have rich theological meanings when we bring it over and take something that people are familiar with, but put in a new level of meaning to it.
Right, and this is not about bringing paganism into the church. This is, well, for one thing, it's about bringing culture into the church and not separating people from their culture needlessly. Sometimes it has to be done because it's, very explicitly pagan or it's very problematic theologically. But if it doesn't have to be done, then we shouldn't do it. But also there's kind of a very pragmatic approach here that sometimes we tend to kind of supernaturalize everything and pretend there were no practical reasons for things entering into our liturgies. And it's quite refreshing to see a pope, just outright saying, whether or not he's correct, it doesn't really matter, but he's just saying, this was done to combat this false idea. We preserved what's true and beautiful, brought it into the light of Christ, and then presented it back to God. I really enjoyed reading that.
It's also interesting to see we have the same feast in every rite, but it's celebrated differently in different rites. And so we see what's important is this common belief in the presentation, but it expresses itself differently in different cultures.
Yeah, right, Rich. It's a beautiful example, and this is, I think, a really strong argument for the Catholic communion as opposed to other ecclesial communities. One of Catholicism's absolute strongest points is the fact that you have so many rites that are in communion, they agree on all the essential things, but it enculturates the faith to the maximum possible. So it's really beautiful to see how if you live somewhere like LA that has a lot of different liturgical rites, you can go from Giz to Latin to Syriac to Byzantine, take communion in all of them, and experience different cultures in a very, very profound way if they're all non-Latinized, kind of faithful to their own tradition. Yeah, it's a really breathtaking experience.
And even in the Middle Ages, where there was basically only the Latin and Maronite rites present in the church was always reaching out to different Eastern Christians to try to reestablish communion. This was done again and again and again. And at times, you do sometimes see Latins who didn't understand other cultures, but that was never the official policy of the church. And it's even interesting to see saints evolve on this over time. So, for example, St. Bonaventure, when he's a young student writing his sentence commentary, he thought, oh, the Greeks are heretical for using leavened bread in the Eucharist. But then later on, it's actually a pope that was a student of his, as well as some other students of his, who called the Second Council of Lyon to try to bring the Greeks back into the church. And we never see him, as far as I'm aware at least, revisit this topic explicitly in his writings. But I'm sure once he actually encountered them and saw them, he realized, okay, this is actually their own ancient venerable tradition, because he was at the council himself, and we never see him at the council objecting anymore to their use of leavened bread. And so even if at times, unfortunately, there were Latins who did not understand various other cultures and tried to make them into Latins, we see that was never the policy of the church, and we frequently see popes even writing against this. Such as Pope Leo XIII already was writing encyclicals telling the Latins to stop trying to Latinize Easterners when they're evangelizing in the East. They said you just bring them into communion with their own liturgical rite, but that's already fine. And interestingly, a friend of mine, Ben Bollinger, was doing some research on this and actually found frequently in the East, because a lot of these Eastern Christians were not thinking in detail which communion are I a part of and stuff. It was more bishops they would try to reestablish communion with. And there was a lot of Jesuits in the Ottoman Empire. And so if an Eastern Christian approached them for confession or communion, they would just ask them, do you believe everything the Holy Fathers teach? And if they said yes, they would assume basically that for all practical purposes, they're in communion.
That's awesome. That's, I get the very fine theological discussions we have today about what separates the Eastern, Oriental, and Catholic communions. But sometimes it feels like this is what we should be doing. Do you agree on all the essentials?
I should clarify that there was a later pope who did not like that anymore and changed the policy to stop that, versus our current canon law basically went back to that older practice in terms of how we receive Easterners. And so there's been various approaches at various times. It seems to be more a question of the positive law of the church. But I think it's interesting to see how these things were approached practically.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that if you read really, really ancient church history, you have I hope I'm saying this right, Quadrideciman, that date of Easter controversy. Mm-hmm. And you can see that the first time it was resolved, it was just kind of East and West coming together and saying, we have this tradition from the apostles. Well, but we have this tradition from the apostles. And they just kind of agreed that if they're both apostolic, then it's fine. They don't have to do the same thing. And then while there was a lot of forced Latinization over history and a lot of, like you said, resistance to quite minor things, there's kind of a scarlet thread throughout church history of respecting the apostolic traditions of the different Eastern churches.
Maybe from here we could turn to looking at what the temple is. Because we looked at ways in which the presentation of Christ fulfills things that are still present in modern Judaism. But obviously something that's lacking in modern Judaism is the temple. And I think if we look at the history of the temple, it actually brings the presentation of Christ into a much deeper meaning. Because fundamentally what's going on here is the bringing of the presence of God into the temple of God, which really fulfills this deep longing that traces all the way through the course of the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. Because already in the first chapter of Scripture, we have the creation narrative. And what's quite interesting is that if you look at the structure of the creation narrative, it actually closely mirrors what are called temple dedication texts. So these were a common thing in the ancient world, especially the ancient Near East, where they would describe the building of a temple and then the God coming to rest in that temple. And so we see that here, that over the course of 6 days, God builds the creation, and the 7th day he comes to rest in the creation. And so this closely matches this temple dedication text, that actually the whole purpose of creation is for the praise of God. And this was actually expanded on some really great research by a Catholic biblical scholar named Peter Kearney. And what Kearney discovered is that if you take the speeches in the book of Exodus, so after the Israelites come out of the Exodus, right? They go to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain. He meets with God up on the mountain. God first gives him the 10 Commandments and some civil laws by which they might live. And then God describes to them this tabernacle that they're supposed to build so that God can dwell among them. And God gives this in a series of 7 speeches to Moses. And if you actually match them up, they match up perfectly with the days of creation. Kearney's article shows this, going through each speech and showing the connections between that speech and the days of creation. So, on one hand, this means the temple that the Israelites had was sort of this little mini version of the whole creation, but also the whole creation is this great temple for the praise of God.
Right. I think you can see it really well in the creation account, where the command that God gave Adam, I don't remember what the English translation is, but it says he gave them the earth to cultivate and to preserve. Mm-hmm. And kind of the word for what I'm using for cultivate is le'ovda u'leshomra. And that root, the Hebrew root of avad, is to work, to cultivate, or to serve, or to worship. So the work at the temple is also called avodah. And even if you look at like the Aramaic version of the saying, today in Hebrew, we properly use pulchan to mean the kind of ritualistic sacrifice or ritual, religious ritual, but it also comes from the Aramaic falach, which means to work or to serve or to cultivate land. So there really is this templistic, very ritualistic language of what God expects Adam and Eve to do in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, you see this as well. There's actually, not only is he placed to till and to keep it is how you should see it translated in the English,
right.
But he's also, it says God took the man and placed him in the garden. And if you go to the book of Numbers, there's a section, I should have put it here in my notes, but I forgot to, where it says, God tells the Levites, I took you and placed you at the gate of the tabernacle to avad and shamar, to till and to keep the tabernacle. And so the same language that's earlier being used in Genesis to describe the work of Adam in the garden is being used here to describe the work of the Levites at the tabernacle. Actually, the whole structure of the Garden of Eden has been shown by biblical scholars to closely match the structure of the tabernacle. And this was actually known in the ancient world. So you'll see ancient Jewish authors discuss the Garden of Eden as this temple. And in the Christian tradition, this is actually best represented by St. Ephrem the Syrian. In the hymns on paradise, he goes into a lot of detail about how all the different parts of the garden corresponded to the parts of the temple, and shows how this was a temple. And this was unfortunately lost in quite a bit of the Christian tradition, but was actually rediscovered, at the very least by the 19th century, because I'm seeing Matthias Schabin, who's sort of the greatest Catholic scholar of the 19th century, discusses this. This is in his Dogmatics, volume 5.2, if anyone's interested in looking into it. When he's discussing the priesthood of Christ, he goes into the history of priesthood in the scriptures and mentions it. And then it also comes up as well in Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI. And this is now well recognized within biblical scholarship. And so right there from the beginning, we see the whole purpose of creation was to be a temple. And so Eden is this miniature temple with Adam as the priest, meant to bring the presence of God to the whole world. But we see Adam falls, and this cuts off man's access to God in the temple. And so when God takes the Israelites for himself as a people, brings them out of slavery in Egypt, the first thing he does is give them his presence again. He gives them this tabernacle. And this is sort of restoring the presence of God to mankind in this way for the first time since the Garden of Eden. Even if it's not as great as the Garden of Eden, it's still the sort of temple presence that we had not had since the Garden of Eden up until that time.
Right. And in a way, when you try to envision what the future would have looked like if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen, um, it's easy to assume there would just be a very immediate connection to God, without like a structured priesthood. And then here, when God chooses to grant people access to him, again, it's interesting that he already structures it in a very, very specific way. And you already, even in, once you know of Jesus in the New Testament and you look back at the very early stages like the tabernacle, you can already kind of see the church in it. You can see Jesus' priesthood in it, in a way it's kind of surprisingly clear for how early it is in the process of salvation history.
Yeah. A lot of saints will write commentaries on this. So you have early on, Origen, for example, write a commentary on it. You have Saint Bede write a commentary. Many different saints write commentaries discussing how all the different furniture of the tabernacle represented Christ in the church in various ways. St. Maximus the Confessor, I'm thinking of as another one, that all these things there were meant to be images of what Christ would come and do, because the purpose of the tabernacle was for God to dwell among us. But who is Christ? He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. And so he represents in himself, or he really is in himself, the reality that was only represented earlier on by the tabernacle.
Right.
Yeah. And we see at important times in history, the temple will be temporarily taken from the people and then restored, which is quite interesting, versus Christ says, I will be with you always until the end of the age. And so Christ is sort of the permanence of what was only had temporarily as well. Because in the days of the prophet Samuel, for example, the Philistines attack and they take the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle. And the Ark of the Covenant was actually never restored to the tabernacle at that point. Instead, later on, we're going to see in the days of King Solomon, he's going to build the first temple where the Ark of the Covenant can rest in something much more glorious than the tabernacle was. But then later on, when the kingdom of Judah is unfaithful and it's destroyed, the temple is destroyed. But when they come back, they build a second temple. But what's notable with the second temple is when the tabernacle was built and the first temple was built, the people actually saw the presence of God be present in the temple. Like it was like they saw some sort of great cloud or something descend into the temple, so they would actually see God's presence there. But when they build the second temple, this is described in the book of Ezra, they do not see the presence of God in the temple. But interestingly, the book of Haggai, in chapter 2, verse 9, it describes actually how the second temple is going to be more glorious than the first. And Haggai was actually there for the building of the second temple. And this probably would have shocked his hearers. Like, we just saw it built. God didn't descend there. But in the presentation of Christ in the temple, it's actually, this temple was more glorious than the first. Because the first, where they saw God descend, but it's still something symbolic. It's meant to represent the presence of God to the people. Versus in the second temple here, we actually see God incarnate himself coming and visiting the second temple. And there's an idea you'll see in some mystical literature, that Jewish mystical literature that is, that the presence of God has never really fully been present in the world, because the tabernacle, the first temple, and the second temple were all built by humans, versus the third temple will descend directly from heaven. And we see that in Christ, who has the presence of God within him, descending from heaven, right? Come down to be with us.
Right. And although there's really no reason to think that the Christ child was brought into the Holy of Holies, that's also a sense in which the fulfillment is much greater than the foreshadowing, because everything that was in the Ark of the Covenant, the tablets of stone and the manna and the staff, all of them just kind of point towards Christ, who now is in the flesh, being brought in by the new Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And the symbol and the reality that it's meant to convey kind of meet in this historical sense. And you can see Simeon and Anna's realization of that. Mm-hmm. And this is actually why this is such a historic event, because this is the first time that this happens. In all of salvation history, that God actually is present in the temple, not in a symbolic way.
And if people are interested in seeing how all that symbolism works out, first of all, St. Paul talks about it a little bit in the book of Hebrews. But as well, if people are interested to go further in depth, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a very good commentary on Hebrews where he goes further in depth on it. And as well, he discusses it in the Summa, in the Prima Secundae. One of the questions he has is the reasons for the ceremonial law. He asks, what was the reason that God gave all these laws to the Israelites? It's actually in translation in the printed edition. It's about 100 pages long where he discusses all of this. It's one of the longest questions in the Summa. And he goes quite into detail on all the various details of the tabernacle. I think that's also interesting to note, right? That what do you hear, like Thomas nowadays often talking about? It's things like natural law, which in translation prints out to a few pages of the Summa. But what is St. Thomas really focused on? It's why did God give all these laws to the people of Israel, and going really in depth into divine revelation here. And so I think that shows a little bit that sometimes our concerns in contemporary Catholic theology might be misplaced to what the saints and what Scripture are actually focused on, which is divine revelation. When Christ is brought into the temple, we have these sort of two scenes of different people realizing what's going on in salvation history. Because most Jews, they just went about their average day, and this was just sort of a normal day for them. But we have these two great scenes of people realizing what's going on. The first one is Saint Simeon. And actually, in a lot of liturgical traditions, Saint Simeon's words are very frequently included as a dismissal in prayer. Because there's this idea that God had preserved the life of Saint Simeon, so that way he could be a witness there for Christ. There's actually a tradition I heard once that he was one of the translators of the Septuagint. And he had translated the verse of the prophecy of Isaiah that a virgin will conceive and bear a son. And he thought this can't possibly be, and so God preserved his life long enough that he would actually be able to see the fulfillment of this. And I don't know if there's any basis to that tradition at all, but we do see in Scripture that God has preserved him here, so that way he can see the fulfillment of the Scriptures. And he refers to Christ as the light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of his people Israel. Various Gentiles do encounter God through the temple. Gentiles could still come and offer sacrifices and stuff, and later temples would even add a section for Gentiles to come and pray at. But it was still primarily with the people of Israel. And we see in the prophets, they always look forward to the day when the message of God will finally go out to all the Gentiles. That part of when the Messiah comes, that's the time when the knowledge of God is supposed to go to the Gentiles. And so St. Simeon, he sees the Messiah is here, and he goes, this is the one who's going to bring the knowledge of God to the Gentiles. And we even see that now, right? That because of Christ, right, we now have over half the world worships the God of Israel. I mean, we can even include the Muslims in a sense in that, insofar as they're sort of a split off from Christianity. And then he's also the glory of Israel. And we can understand this in sort of two ways, right? We could understand that he is the glory of the church, of the new Israel. But also he is the glory, I think, of Israel according to the flesh, of the Jewish people. Because it's very interesting that now you have, right, all throughout the world, these various Gentiles recognizing this Jewish person, right, Jesus Christ, as the Messiah, as God incarnate. And so there's this way in which Christ brings the Jewish people to all the nations. And even in the Catholic tradition, while we're not dispensationalists, the Church has traditionally recognized a sort of unique place in divine providence for the Jewish people. That there is something sort of unique about them. Not in a way that Jews are superior or anything. I want to be very clear about this. Some people misrepresent us sometimes as saying that. But rather that simply God has placed the Jewish people at a unique place in providence. And I think we can even use this when we're speaking to Jews about Christ. Isn't it so interesting that you have all these Gentiles worshiping a Jewish man, right? You have all these Gentiles recognizing a Jewish man as the Jewish Messiah, because he's the glory of Israel to the nations.
Right. I think with what Saint Simeon says about the light of the Gentiles, it strikes me, even though it's in the biblical tradition, as you pointed out, it strikes me as kind of unique, because when you see, maybe it's due to his age, I don't know, But when you see the younger apostles speaking to Jesus, everybody's kind of very preoccupied with the occupation, the Roman occupation of the land of Israel. And they're all kind of, eagerly anticipating Jesus to reveal himself as a military leader, vanquish the Romans, and redeem the Holy Land. But that's not the first thing Saint Simeon says. He is focused on Christ going out to the Gentiles and sanctifying them, not primarily conquering anything for Israel, which I think is just kind of a very delicate, sweet insight into his intimacy with God and the clear picture of salvation that he had, that a lot of people, because of the political situation, kind of lost sight of, which we who live in very turbulent times politically can often fall into as well. And I think you're right in saying that maybe the second part of his statement about the nation of Israel kind of really needs to be emphasized. I remember when I lived in Europe, we did Vespers in Latin every Sunday evening, me and a couple of friends. And I remember at a certain point I caught on to what chapter and verse of Psalm it was, because it's often said during Kabbalat Shabbat service. And it kind of struck me that I'm the only Jewish person in the room, and everybody there is giving thanks to the God of Israel. And it was very interesting because you had Germans there, you had Americans there, you had Scottish people there, but none of them were worshiping German, Scottish, whatever gods. They were all worshiping the God of Israel. And it's kind of really brought home to me the greatness of what Christianity did for mankind. And while Jews, I think, do understand it, even if they think Christianity is theologically wrong, that this is a good thing to emphasize with people, I think, that even if the church has sometimes failed to do it, one of the things that Christ did in fact do, even if both Jews and the church didn't see it at times, is bring glory to the nation of Israel, through whom the Messiah came and redeemed the entire world. And this is not novelty. This is in saints, going back to the Middle Ages, going back to late antiquity. You can see it all over. Even if most of the Jews currently do not accept the Messiah, there's glory there for the nation of Israel in the fact that he came through them. And St. Paul very explicitly says that the nation of Israel will become a Christian nation eventually. And when they do, they'll have this glorious realization of their place in salvation history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's also interesting here, right after he does the blessing for the child, but then he turns to Mary and he says, "Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is spoken against. And a sword will pierce through your heart also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed." So we see here, first of all, there's the fall and rising of Israel going on here, that Christ is the sign of contradiction, that there's some sort of division that's brought in as soon as you mention Christ. There's going to be people of very strong opinions of different ways. But then also the sword piercing through the heart of Mary. There's a connection here to this idea that Mary participates in the redemptive work of Christ through her suffering. And there was a recent Vatican document discussing this a bit, that it preferred not to use the word co-redemptrix. This is sometimes misunderstood by Protestants to say that we're saying that Mary redeems in the same way that Christ is redeeming. But no, it's rather that she participates. And the document reaffirmed this, that Mary participates in Christ's redeeming work through her own suffering as well. And really all of us as well, but Mary in this unique way of being so close to Christ.
Right. It's only the latest of many examples in how low Mariology eventually leads to low Christology.
Mm-hmm. Yes. As well, the second person we see here, besides Saint Simeon, is the prophetess Anna. And it's interesting that it mentions that she is from the tribe of Asher, which should really shock us, because we hadn't heard about Asher reading the Bible in a long time. Right? Because initially with the kingdom of Israel, with all 12 tribes under David and Solomon, but after the death of Solomon, the kingdom splits in two, and you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the tribe of Asher is part of the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom is invaded by the Assyrians and taken into exile and are sort of lost to history. Some of them survive becoming the Samaritans, other ones go south and integrate into Judah, but the vast majority of them are sort of lost to history. But we see here that there are at least some of them that are still sort of staying around, that we have here one from the tribe of Asher. But part of the big question that was going on in Jesus' day was that, all right, we could see how God could redeem the Jews, right? That he could rebuild, we could have a Messiah who would come and rebuild the temple, conquer the nations, and so on. But, like, where would the northern tribes come from? They're sort of seemed lost to history. And so part of the big question was, how is God going to redeem the northern tribes? And by seeing a woman here from the tribe of Asher, it draws our attention not only to the redemption of the subset of the people of Israel, the Jews, but to the whole people of Israel. And this is mentioned as well. St. Paul, near the end of the book of Acts, mentions is the hope of our people, the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's this hope always of somehow to bring the northern tribes back as well. And we see her praying and giving thanks to God. It says, and spoke to him of all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. I think it's important here that Luke is the only writer of the New Testament who's a Gentile. And he writes Luke and Acts. And Luke and Acts are intended to be one work. And it's interesting that he is so concerned with all this Jewish ritual at the beginning of the gospel. Like, you would think that all of this would be in the Gospel of Matthew, but Matthew sort of glosses over this. He mentions the circumcision very briefly, and we don't get anything else about Jewish rituals and Jesus' birth. Versus Luke spends a long time to discuss the circumcision, the presentation of the temple, and Jesus going to visit the temple as a child in these pilgrimages for various feasts. And so Luke is very concerned with the Jewishness of Jesus at the beginning of the gospel. And this interestingly continues on in the book of Acts. We're going to have someone on soon to discuss the book of Acts. But it's interesting that we keep returning to Jerusalem in the book of Acts. And even in the very end of the book of Acts, it ends with Paul going to Rome. And when he gets to Rome, the first thing he does is he goes to the synagogue to try to convince the Jewish leaders of Jesus. And then he's unsuccessful there. And so it's sort of the book of Acts ends looking forward to the day when Jerusalem finally will be redeemed. When Jesus is giving the version of the Olivet Discourse in Luke, he mentions that there will be this time of the Gentiles that will be fulfilled. And this idea, there's a long period throughout the history of the church where the church primarily goes to the Gentiles and Jerusalem is ruled over by the Gentiles. But the time of the Gentiles will be fulfilled, where there will be the redemption of the people of Israel. And if you read, for example, St. Bede's commentary on the time of the Gentiles, and it's taken up by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Catena Aurea, they even hypothesize that maybe even the kingdom of Israel would actually even be restored, so an earthly kingdom even to the Jews, even if ultimately what we're looking forward to is the heavenly kingdom of the church.
Yeah, right. I think this topic of the eventual conversion of Israel is kind of not well discussed enough. Mm-hmm. And with the hot topic last couple of weeks being Zionism, I think it's also worth mentioning that, and I'm not saying this to drive a political agenda at all, but it is interesting that you can see it in the Catholic tradition, that the land of Israel and the people of Israel are still kind of connected. It's just that most people saw these two things as kind of reuniting once there's a general conversion within the nation of Israel. But it is what St. Paul talks about so clearly. A lot of people don't, either on the very Philo-Semitic side or the very anti-Semitic side, don't want to do that work of helping Jews come to Christ. But all along the great saints of the tradition, it's been clear that eventually the nation of Israel will be a Christian nation.
The existence of Jewish Christians such as ourselves, it really places, I think, what St. Simeon's talking there about the sign of contradiction in the current discussion of Jewish-Christian dialogue. Because everyone is sort of very comfortable when Jews and Christians are non-overlapping groups, right? You can have either you're going to be very hateful towards one another, whether you be a Jew or a Christian, and you don't like the other side, and you can say this is this other false religion, or you can take the modern route of wanting a better relationship between the two and saying, all right, we're going to dialogue, but don't worry, Jews, we're not trying to convert you, and don't worry, Christians, we're not trying to convert you. But when you have someone here who says, no, I'm a member of the Jewish people, but I accept Jesus as the Messiah, and I've joined myself to the church, well, now you have this very difficult question of, all right, however you want, whether you want to use the word mission or convert or not, there's clearly a sense in which we want our fellow Jews to become members of the church. So there's that difficulty towards the Jewish side. And likewise to the Christian side, they now have to see that, all right, Jews are not actually a foreign body, whether we view them positively or negatively. They're also part of ourselves. And this has been the big question, I think, that's been raised in many ways by our existence. That can be very difficult, I think, to a lot of people.
Right. And I think we don't really need to explain why anti-Semitism par excellence is satanic, just as every other kind of racism is. But it is worth maybe taking a little bit of time to talk about how religious indifferentism is just as equally devastating. There was a rabbi, I forget his name, he wrote a book called Kol Koreh, A Voice Crying Out, which was actually his commentary on the Gospels. It was very interesting, but you can see, and he kind of almost defends the Trinity using an example from the Talmud. And it's very easy to see that and get very excited and say, well, here you go, Jewish sources kind of commentating on the New Testament, but his point is not to help Jews come to Christ. His point is to show that Christianity is fine as a Gentile religion, and we don't need to be polemic about it. And he is just kind of trying to still the waters and make sure nobody crosses over. And while I don't like the statement that the most anti-Semitic thing you can do is not preach Christ to Jews, because you can also preach Christ to Jews in a way that's very wrong, we don't want to fall into that trap of religious indifferentism, which is actually so common today with dispensationalism. That's actually what it creates. The Jewish people don't actually need Christ. They can do well enough on their own. But no, Christ is the glory of the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel is not fully itself until it finds itself again in Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why I think we should probably maybe do an episode later on where we discuss questions around Zionism in more detail. But something that I have often, a big issue I have with sort of the Zionist movement as it was represented by a lot of the secular Zionists, like you have, like Herzl and other people, is that, to me, the ultimate messianic hope of the people of Israel, or it's the restoration of Israel, but that includes being ruled over the Messiah, who is Jesus Christ. It includes following the ethical precepts that are taught by the prophets, and I feel that if those are not included, that often, like Herzl's vision, right, seems to be that he wants Israel to be a nation like all the other nations. When he wanted to bring in European nationalism to that, when the whole point of the calling of the Jewish people was to not be a nation like the other nations. That's, Balaam refers to them, right? That they are a nation not counted among the nations. And so there can be a tendency, I think, sometimes to miss that the messianic hope is something greater than just, all right, we're going to be nice to Jewish people. The messianic hope is the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, which, if we believe Jesus is the Messiah, has to include their acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think regardless of what people think of Zionism, the political movement, I'm not talking about Christian Zionism, TM, which is a dispensationalist, theological, eschatological world of thought. I don't think it's a coincidence that the time that the Jews are returning to the land of Israel, even if it is by political means, is when we have the largest number of Jewish Christians since the first century. In the book of Acts, it describes myriads of Jewish Christians, which, if we take that to be literally, it's probably got like 20, 30,000. If we take that to be hyperbole, maybe a good few thousands within Jerusalem. Now in Israel, estimates from both Christian-friendly and Christian-unfriendly sources speak about there being about 30,000 Jewish Christians and Messianic Jews in Israel. So we're just now getting back to that time, or back to those numbers that we had in the first century. And you can see that starting before the Holocaust, before World War II, and then really exploding after World War II, with people not only coming to Christ, but coming to Christ and not assimilating into Gentile cultures, coming to Christ, as Father Antoine Levy calls it, remaining Israel qua Israel, which even the church is, the Catholic Church is starting to appreciate how important that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's the sense in which, I'm not saying the times of the Gentiles or something are necessarily over that we see in Luke, but it seems to be, just as there was this transitionary period from Christ came, we still see the apostles being essentially Jews, but also bringing in the church. There was this time of transition from that to, by, say, the 3rd or 4th century, we no longer really see a Jewish presence within the church. Perhaps we're in the transitionary period the other way, in which Israel, along with all the other nations, can together worship Christ as a united church.
Right. We've been having a very steady growth for the past 2,000 years. The Church of the Gentiles, and then the Church of the Circumcision grew exponentially, died off, and now is rising again, hopefully to form a lasting presence, within the true church that Christ has established.
Right. Maybe we briefly mention as well that St. Thomas Aquinas goes into a discussion of the pure presentation of Christ in the temple and the purification of Mary at the temple in the Summa Theologiae and the Tertia Pars, question 37, articles 3 and 4. And I think most of what we said here has already covered most of what he's said. There's a few interesting points I think we haven't touched on yet that I wanted to bring out. Because in Article 3, one of the questions he asks, interestingly, is if the sacrifices are an image of what Christ would do, why is a sacrifice offered for Christ? Because it seems unfitting that a type should be offered for the reality. And he actually says, no, it's actually perfectly fitting that a type be offered for the reality. Because this is sort of Christ communicating the reality back to the type. That everything Christ does, he does fulfilling the law. And so one of the things he has to fulfill is not only the offering of sacrifice and the offering of himself, but having sacrifice offered for him. And so he has sacrifice here offered for him, fulfilling the law of sacrifice and showing his approval of the law of sacrifice. Even if, of course, we wouldn't bring that back now.
Right. This is actually a really good kind of counter argument to what you often hear. Jews looking at Gentile Christianity, what they see is a certain type of religion that just stopped existing overnight and turned into something completely different. And of course, when you kind of go deeper into Catholic thinking and Christian thinking, you see that's patently false. But also, it's really nice to see how Christ has kind of faded these two phases of salvation history together, where the sacrificial work continues and he takes part in it. And you can kind of see the type and the antitype come together, really appreciate what this was all supposed to be pointing towards. And there isn't an artificial separation between the age of the temple and the age of the church. There's a smooth transition from one to the other.
Yeah. And it also, St. Thomas also mentions here that it was important. Galatians 4:4-5 says that Christ was made under the law that he might redeem those who were under the law. And so, going back earlier to our discussion of religious indifferentism, we see that Christ participating in this whole Jewish life, in all the rituals of the Torah, that he did that because he came to redeem the people who were under the Torah. That he didn't only come for the Gentiles, he also came for the Jews, and that destroys the possibility of the religious indifferentism approach to Christianity. Then he goes on in Article 4 to discuss the purification of Mary in the temple. Because he points out that, according to tradition, since Mary was immaculately conceived, she did not have the pains of childbirth, because these were the result of original sin. So there's the question of, well, then there would have been no flow of blood. So why does she need to go to the temple in order to purify herself? And so St. Thomas, he gives this really beautiful answer. He says, as the fullness of grace flowed from Christ onto his mother, so it was becoming that the mother should be like her son in humility. For God giveth grace to the humble, as it is written, James 4:6. And therefore, just as Christ, though not subject to the law, wished nevertheless to submit to circumcision and the other burdens of the law, in order to give an example of humility and obedience, in order to show his approval for the law, and again in order to take away from the Jews any excuse for calumniating him. For the same reasons, he wished his mother also to fulfill the prescriptions of the law, to which, nevertheless, she was not subject. So even though, right, she was not required to actually do this purification here, she still did it to show her approval of the law, to submit in humility to it, and so that way no one could say that she was not following the law. She wanted to, even where it wasn't absolutely necessary to follow the law, just like with Christ, they want to do it in order to show their full approval of it.
Right. This really corresponds well with some of the terrible things you sometimes hear about the Blessed Mother in the Jewish tradition, which a lot of people actually don't know came. It's a copy from Roman traditions about Mary, got inserted into the Jewish tradition. But if Mary was promiscuous, or this isn't kind of a post hoc argument to prove Mary was chaste. This is somebody giving a historical narrative showing that it was important for Mary and Joseph to meticulously follow the law. If this was kind of an extramarital affair sort of thing, you want to do it all in hiding. You don't go up to the temple. You minimize it as much as you can. But no, Mary here, even though she was immaculately conceived, wants to do everything down to the T.
Absolutely. That's everything we have for today. Thank you everyone for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe, like it, hit the notification bell so you can see our new episodes as they come up. If you're listening on a podcasting platform, please subscribe there, leave us a good review. And then please as well, you can share our podcasts on social media, and you can also follow us on social media. We're on pretty much everything: Facebook, X, Threads, Instagram. Please share us and help support us, and thank you so much for watching.
יתגלה מהר סיני, דינך אמת ואמיתה, הוד ויקר היא מלכותך, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל. עלהו בו עמנואל, ופדה משבי ישראל, שמתייפח בגלותו, עד בן האל בא לפדותו, עלוז ושמח עמנואל, להולדתו של ישראל.